Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather. If you want to know where the power lies in this government, consider the Senate's agenda for this week. Following the death of 17 people in the Parkland, Florida school shooting last month, almost two-thirds of the American people favor an outright ban on automatic and semi-automatic rifles. It has bipartisan support in the Senate, which returned to work, or as close to work as they ever do today. But the Senate's first order of business was not guns. It was making life easier for banks. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced on Thursday that despite bipartisan pressure to vote on a variety of gun bills, banks would come first, with work to begin on Tuesday. Less than 10 years after Congress bailed out banks and imposed modest restrictions on them with the Dodd-Frank legislation, the Senate this week is working on a bill making it easier for banks to take the kind of risks that blew up the economy last time. The bill is backed by Republicans, but also by 12 Democrats. Now, you will hear that the bill is not dangerous because it's only for small banks. But you should know that actual Main Street banks are already exempt from Dodd-Frank. You will hear that the bill does not roll back regulations on the big Wall Street banks, but you should know that it rolls back regulations on for banks with as much as $250 billion in assets. And some of them were big enough a decade ago to need taxpayer bailouts. According to an exhaustive report on the bill by The Intercept, it also frees smaller banks from having to report exactly the kind of data that reveal discriminatory lending patterns, which means even data from the big banks won't be useful anymore. President Trump has already neutered the agency created by Dodd-Frank to police racist lending practices. Now, if this bill passes, we won't even have the data anymore to know that it's happening. And as for helping small banks, keep in mind that by raising the limits on how big a bank can be without bumping into federal oversight, this bill creates an incentive for banks to get bigger. And they do that by eating smaller banks. This bill may have started as a well-intentioned effort to help out smaller banks. But while it's true that some smaller banks are struggling and some have failed, the majority of them are making money. No, the only reason this bill got this far is because it helps out the biggest banks. It helps them shift risk to you and reward them. It encourages exactly the kind of gambles that toppled the world economy a decade ago. But it's a bipartisan bill, and no one with money is lined up on the other side. You may want to note, and exclusive tonight, the Young Turks is reporting that several Democratic co-sponsors of the bill not only received donations from some of the big banks lobbying on this, some of them even own stock. The number one recipient of banking donations, Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, owns stock in J.P. Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway, valued between $350,000 and as much as almost $900,000. With all the money aligned behind it, the only thing left to stop the bill is exactly what's changing the battle over guns. Young Americans standing up, speaking out, settling for nothing short of what is right. It was young people, the blood they shed in Parkland and the battles they have waged since then, that led President Trump last week to say for real what Republicans always imagined that Democrats think, that he, the president, was coming for their guns. Mr. Trump has since muddled that message, muddied it up. That's, of course, what he does. But more than his remarks, the reaction clarified something horribly wrong with our politics, not just in the last year, but over the last 2+ decades. The hostage-taking mindset of partisan, highly partisan politics. Specifically, the notion that only Republicans enjoy the public trust to commit actions that are not only seen, but described as treason under Democrats. raising the debt ceiling, cutting military spending, negotiating with enemies, criminal justice reform, reforming immigration, increasing the deficit, gun control. Republicans can be flexible as long as they are in power. Otherwise, look out. For 8 years, gun sales skyrocketed as Republican politicians and commentators assured the nation that Democrats were coming for their guns. And that was when Democrats proposed the tamest of gun control measures. The silence on the right in response to President Trump's proposed power grab, explicitly tossing out due process, was loud enough to rattle even Fox News.
At one point, the president said the government should, quote, take the guns first, go through due process second. Now, I mean, how honest do you want to be? Imagine if Barack Obama had said that. Just ignore due process and start confiscating guns. Well, Obama would have been denounced as a dictator. We would have denounced him first, trust me. Congress would be talking impeachment right now. Someone would be muttering about secession.
We don't have to imagine whether the right would have called President Obama a dictator for saying what Mr. Trump said. They called him a dictator for saying less. In 2015, Carlson himself accused President Obama of coming for our guns, not for saying anything like President Trump just did, for trying to give law enforcement at the EPA weaponry to defend themselves.
It can't be a coincidence that at the very moment that the federal government and all agencies, not just the EPA, but all of them, are arming up, buying guns and ammunition in bulk, politicians are telling the rest of us, the citizens who pay for the government, we're not allowed to be armed. There's an effort to take our guns even as government arms up.
Fast forward, and today we have a president who is openly arming domestic law enforcement agencies and militarizing police. And he is talking about stripping due process to take away guns. But the best the right can do is imagine what they would have said about Obama instead of actually saying it about Trump. So the real question isn't whether the right would have called Obama a dictator then. They did. The real question is why they don't call Trump a dictator now. I want to talk about President Trump's tariff threat, trade war and all that, and want to talk about something happening under our noses in West Virginia that actually could help workers. That's next. President Trump this week will give us new details, or possibly whiplash, on his stunning announcement of tariffs on foreign aluminum and steel, which may be the dumbest and most dangerous thing he has done. Yes, I know there's much competition for that title, but by any objective analysis, this latest move may be the worst. That is not just my opinion. It is an analysis based on facts and includes historical context and perspective. And it is the conclusion of many, if not most, economists, trade experts, historians, and press editorialists. Even Mr. Trump's cheerleaders on the Wall Street Journal editorial board view the president's decision as almost jaw-droppingly dumb and dangerous. Congressional Republicans went to work Monday on how to stop it. Stock markets have waned in the wake of the move. Farmers and car makers are aghast. Tensions with China have increased. Talk of a possible all-out trade war has given friends, foes, and those in between a bad case of the jitters. In the background are memories of the 1920s, when extreme economic nationalism, not patriotism, but nationalism, led to spreading tariff protections and eventual trade wars that in turn led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The overall general consensus now seems to be some version of, what in the world could Trump be thinking? One answer put forward by some is that Mr. Trump is once again seeking to shore up his base, seeking favor with blue-collar voters in old-line manufacturing states such as Pennsylvania and Michigan, in both of which he upset Hillary Clinton. If that's true, it makes the decision even worse. It would mean he's seeking personal, political, and election advantage. But what about the country? Never mind him and whatever benefit he may think it gives him. his political movement, and his chances for re-election, what about the country? It's true that unions in steel and aluminum states are applauding the move, but they stand virtually alone. The rest of the economy, the rest of America, will pay the price, literally, for more expensive steel. Thousands of jobs in other industries teeter on the precipice as the rest of the world threatens to retaliate by raising prices on American goods sold in their countries. It may feel good to do something bold and aggressive in defense of an industry resonant with nostalgia, but defending the American economy requires smarts and discipline. America has protected its workers far better than this, and we can do so again. If you want to know how America protects its workers, well, you might want to look to West Virginia. As we told you last week, teachers across the state are on strike after rising health costs reduced their take-home pay. It is one of America's largest strikes in recent years, and it appears to be working. The State House of Delegates approved a 5% raise. The Republican governor is on board with that. Only the state Senate stands in the way, and they approved a 4% raise over the weekend. This, remember, in a state, West Virginia, that ranks 48th for teacher pay. Republicans have said the state cannot afford it, but they also oppose taxing the big energy interests taking resources from the West Virginia ground to pay for it. As some of the strike leaders have pointed out, working-class West Virginians have a heritage of organizing together to take on big energy. Modern political coverage often overlooks it, but as West Virginia Democratic State Senator Richard Ojeda has pointed out, organized labor has a powerful history and legacy in states we consider pure red.
Some of us are proud. When it comes time to standing up for one another, we're proud to carry the moniker of redneck, because that's what happened when coal miners were tired of being abused, mistreated, and they stood together and they fought to unionize. And they put those bandanas around their neck, and let me tell you something, they were called rednecks. But in the end, once again, they may have lost that battle, but they won that war and they unionized.
It's a painful irony that President Trump bellows across the oceans about tough guy tariffs while neglecting the levers he can use to truly help working people. His own nominee to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch, heard a case just last week that could approach something like a death knell for public unions if Gorsuch votes against them. The importance of bargaining power should be crystal clear to anyone who fancies himself a deal maker. They certainly understand it in Oklahoma, where teachers make even less than they do in West Virginia. More than 30,000 people have joined a Facebook page calling for a statewide walkout in Oklahoma, which they're now looking at for April. The Labor News website Payday Report yesterday said teachers in Kentucky and Pennsylvania are considering solidarity strikes. So even if President Trump and Justice Gorsuch do go against the unions, if West Virginia and Oklahoma are any indication, the drive to fight back, the drive to fight forward together is growing too fast to stop and may do more for working Americans than President Trump can dream of. What's next for Puerto Rico? Possibly water rationing. I'll tell you why after this. Much of the northeast U.S. is recovering today from a deadly storm that knocked down trees and knocked out power for more than 1 million people. Now imagine if much of the northeast were still recovering from that storm next September. And now imagine that some services were not recovering. They were getting worse. Welcome to Puerto Rico. After almost 6 months following Hurricane Maria, the power is not expected to be restored for everyone until at least May. Those parts of the island that do have power continue to suffer from outages and blackouts. And water supplies are not getting better. In some regions, they're getting worse. Thanks to a combination of Maria's destruction and recent drought, they're actually on the verge of announcing water rationing. Water rationing in 21st century America. And national media have virtually nothing to say about it, with the exception of an overlooked report online from David Begnew of CBS News. So give the young man credit.
This will affect 5 municipalities, we're told, on the western side of the island. The Oaxaca Lake has dropped to a level that is not sufficient for water production. So within the last 24 to 48 hours, officials have been talking about rationing water. They've not pulled the trigger, so to speak. We're told that could happen Monday or Tuesday of next week. But if they do, water rationing could begin as early as next Friday.
Water in the United States is literally receding from us. But all we hear from national news is Hope Hicks. And folks, it's not just drought, and it's not just Puerto Rico. You may not have heard it on your TV news, but on Tuesday, President Trump signed an executive order to roll back the Waters of the United States rule, reducing the power of environmental regulators to protect against corporate pollution in our water. We're talking about 2/3 of America's waterways and the water supply for more than 100 million people. Extreme weather caused by climate change, droughts, storms, floods, they all threaten our ready access to safe drinking water. We need, now more than ever, to ramp up our vigilance when it comes to protecting this most basic right. That means standing up to our own government and telling this administration and all others that we will not let Wall Street sell our own water back to us and will not let it poison the rest. I want to share my defense of the young people leading the way on guns right after this. Other stories we're keeping an eye on, and think you should. Warm air is causing temperatures in the Arctic to rise 45 degrees above normal. Within less than a week, the North Pole is expected to go above freezing. Well over 1/3 of the ice covering the Bering Sea off Alaska's west coast may disappear in slightly over a week. Arctic ice in general has shrunk to its lowest level on record, and spring is still 2 weeks away. New guidelines from the Trump administration favor family planning methods other than contraception for new federal grants. This shift toward abstinence could make it harder for groups such as Planned Parenthood to obtain funding in the future. It could also lead to unwanted pregnancies, even among those not attempting abstinence. So-called natural family planning, such as the rhythm method, can lead to pregnancies in about 1/4 of women who rely on them, according to the federal government. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Washington on Monday to meet with President Trump. Priority one for Netanyahu was trying to push the U.S. to take a much harder stand against Iran's regional ambitions. Netanyahu went into his meeting with Trump having just been named as a suspect in a 3rd criminal investigation, with his former chief of staff agreeing to testify against him. And an update on the massive hedge fund BlackRock, which we told you about after the Parkland shooting. As we reported, BlackRock has been investing in gun makers, including the company that owns Smith & Wesson, which made the rifle used in Parkland. On Friday, BlackRock said it will now give clients the option to invest in funds that do not include gun makers, and said it will push gun makers for answers about preventing illegal use of their weapons. And finally tonight, let me talk to you about cynicism. Cynicism is a destructive force. It's one that seems to increase with age, and that's why the young have often been, throughout history, the harbingers of change. They are able to cast aside the repressive change of the status quo to see injustices from a new vantage point. They demand answers to questions that their elders forgot needed to be asked. It has long been a trope for those later in life to bemoan the qualities of the young. I heard it in the 1960s during an era of unrest. The young protesters for civil rights and against Vietnam were dismissed as naive, idealistic and unrealistic. Today, we hear how the young are selfish, unable to think beyond their own needs, and addicted to their status on social media. Never mind that it was many of their elders who used social media as unwitting tools of Russian influence in the last election. But in my travels, I come across a lot of young people, and I sense an energy and seriousness to deal with big problems that will only grow as they grow older, climate change being a prominent example. The young understand the injustices on race, sexual identity, and gender. In an age of #MeToo, they will not stay quiet for what was once acceptable. And in an age of Trump, they will fight for the expansive view of democracy their parents told them was the American destiny. I'm not surprised that it's the young who are leading the campaign for an honest gun debate in the wake of the Florida massacre. Wow, they're so well-spoken and poised, has been the incredulous response from some. Not me. I see it and hear it all the time. There's a lurking belief among the young that the American dream will not be in their reach, that the cynical forces of power have rigged the system against them. But they're doing what young people have always done. They're demanding that we all recognize we can do better. They're not going to allow this to pass without their voices being heard in the streets, through civic and community engagement, and most importantly, at the ballot box. With that, I leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady.